Hello, my unraveled friends. Welcome back to Tiff Unraveled. I'm Tiff, and if you're new here, then welcome. I'm happy to have you. Most of the time, um, on my channel, we kind of dive headfirst into these very complex, ongoing cases with twists and turns that are like happening as we speak. But today, I kind of wanted to just do something a little different. I did this with the Brian Wells case. I kind of just want to cozy up, settle in, and just tell you a story. We're going to go back in time to a case that has been solved. It is solved, but its conclusion did a lot more than just catch a killer. It changed the world of modern forensics as we know it. So it takes place in these two small villages, kind of in the heart of England. I hope I'm saying them right. Narborough and Enderby. In the early 1980s, these were the kind of quiet, unassuming places where everyone knew their neighbors, and violent crime was this thing that happened somewhere else to other people. It didn't happen there. It was that place that we all hear about with, unlocked doors and children playing in the street until dusk. But that cherished peace was about to be stolen. This is the story of two 15-year-old girls. It's the story of a community that became paralyzed by fear. And it is also the story of a scientific miracle that was born just in time to stop a monster. With that being said, let's unravel. So the story today begins on a very cold November night in 1983. Linda Mann, she was a clever and determined teenage girl. She was a summer baby. She loved fashion and bright colors, and she spent a lot of her free time sketching her own outfits. Still kind of sick, so you guys bear with me here. We're going to get through this story. So on the evening of November 21st, she was walking home from a babysitting job. And instead of her usual route, she took a shortcut. And the shortcut was down this kind of dark and unlit footpath that a lot of the locals used. A lot of the local children used to walk to school on that path. It was a frequently used path, but at night it was dark and it was a little more secluded. And they called this path the Black Pad. Linda never made it home that evening. So Linda's parents and her neighbors, once her parents became worried, once they realized that she should have been home long ago. Again, Linda was a very reliable girl. She had no history of running away or doing things like this. So parents started searching and the neighbors joined in the search. There were just calls of her name echoing in the darkness that night, but there was no reply. The next morning, a hospital porter on his way to work saw what he first described as what he thought was a mannequin, like lying in the grass. It was not a mannequin. It was Linda. She had been brutally, sexually assaulted, and she had been strangled by her own scarf. The Leicestershire Constabulary. I know. I'm trying. Leicestershire Constabulary launched a massive investigation at this point. They had over 150 of their officers swarming that area, but they hit a wall almost immediately. The only clue that they had was a semen sample that was taken from Linda's body. In 1983, like the most advanced forensics at that time could really only tell them one thing from this sort of clue, and that was that the killer had type A blood. This was a characteristic that was shared by like 1 in every 10 men. So the case went cold, unfortunately, at that point. And for 3 years, there was this shadow that was hanging over this community. I mean, imagine there's newspaper headlines being run that says like killer in our midst, warning its readers that, quote, if we don't catch him, it could be your daughter next. That's terrifying. I mean, people are looking at their neighbors and their friends or strangers walking down the street, and they're not knowing. I mean, this person is out there. They were concerned that because this person had not been caught, that this could happen again. And they were proven right. 3 years later, almost 3 years later, on July 31st, 1986, the nightmare begins again. Dawn Ashworth, she was also a 15-year-old girl, also a sensible girl, loving. She used to use the money that she would earn from her weekend job to buy her mother these really pretty bouquets of flowers. Just a sweet, thoughtful girl. She took a shortcut down a similar path called 10 Pound Lane on her way to a friend's house, and she vanished. When she didn't return, her parents called the police, and this very frantic 2-day long search ended with the discovery of her body in a wooded area, partially concealed with twigs and branches. She had very visibly fought for her life, and she, like Linda, had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The method was almost identical to Linda's murder. When the biological sample that they retrieved from Dawn as well was tested, it did reveal the same type A blood group. But again, 1 in every 10 men had this blood type. And so we're stuck. Again, we don't really know where to go from here. The police and the community now faced their very worst fear. There was a killer out there who was hunting their children, and the pressure to find him, as you can imagine, was immense. And in that desperation, this investigation was about to take a disastrously wrong turn. So we know that with fear and desperation comes pressure. The entire community at this point is gripped by terror, and the police are desperate for some sort of breakthrough. Their attention very quickly fell on this young man named Richard Buckland. He was a 17-year-old kitchen porter with some learning difficulties. He was described by those who knew him as simple-minded. Buckland had known Dawn Ashworth and very crucially, apparently seemed, according to police, had seemed to possess this knowledge of details about her body that had not been made public. And so very quickly, Richard Buckland was named the prime suspect. He was brought in for questioning, and what followed was this grueling 15-hour interrogation. For 2 days, he was isolated from his parents, who were simply told that he was, quote, helping with inquiries. So inside of this interrogation room, the detectives used a mix of techniques, including confrontation and minimization. So they told him, quote, "We know that you're not telling the truth, and we must have the truth," unquote, while also suggesting to Richard that they understand that the killing could have been an accident and that maybe he wasn't truly to blame, by making statements like, "I don't think you intended to kill her." So for someone like Richard, right, he's this vulnerable teenage boy. Under this intense psychological pressure, he broke. He began to confess to Dawn's murder. His statements, though, by all accounts, were confused and they were inconsistent. He would admit to the crime and then he would withdraw that admission. Over and over again, this happened. But he gave them what they wanted, which was a motive. He told them, how do I put this? He stated that his motive was that he was aroused and that he wanted to get rid of it somehow. And so he wanted to find out what it was really like. Quote, "So I done it," unquote. On August 10th, 1986, Richard Buckland was formally charged and arrested for the murder of Dawn Ashworth. But here's the thing. There was this huge glaring problem as far as this was concerned. While Richard had confessed to killing Dawn, he adamantly and consistently and vehemently denied having anything to do with Linda Mann's murder 3 years prior. And the police were certain that one man, one person, had killed both girls. But instead of seeing this as a sign of his innocence and maybe false confession, their confirmation bias starts to take over, and they saw it as proof instead that he was a liar. They were convinced that they had their man. They just needed to prove somehow that he was responsible for both of these crimes. Their search for that proof would not lead them to a conviction, however, but to a scientific revolution that would save Richard Buckland from a life in prison and change our criminal justice system forever. So here's the cool part. As police were building their case against the wrong man, child, boy, a quiet miracle was unfolding just 5 miles away, okay? At the University of Leicester. Leicester. Fuck, this sucks. At the University of Leicester, a geneticist named Dr. Alex Jeffrey. He was already immersed in this purely academic research. And on the morning of September 10th, 1984, a year after Linda's murder, but 2 years prior to Dawn's, he walks into his lab. Excuse me. And he's looking at this X-ray film that he had developed from an experiment. And his first thought was, oh my God, what a fucking mess. What a mess, he says. But in looking at that mess, he had what he called a quote, blinding flash and a quote, absolute eureka moment, unquote. He realized that he was looking at a pattern, a series of bands unique to every single person. He had accidentally discovered a way to create a quote genetic fingerprint. The science is very complex, as you can imagine, but the idea here, I'll try to put it simply. In our DNA, there are repeating sequences that vary dramatically from person to person. And Dr. Jeffries had found a way to visualize those sequences by accident, creating a very unique barcode, if you will, for every individual on the planet, right? So fast forward now, Buckland is in custody, and detectives, they were stuck. Because they were very desperately trying to link Buckland to both murders. Because again, they were convinced if he did one, he had to have done the other. They knew that the same person had done both of these terrible acts, but they just had to prove that it was Buckland that did both. Now, he had admitted to being responsible for Dawn's murder, but was refusing to take accountability in their eyes for Linda's murder. And so they had heard about this research that was being done on DNA evidence, and they knew they had this preserved sample from both scenes. And so in this last ditch effort, they made a call to Dr. Jeffrey's lab. Could his new but unproven science help their case? That's what they were hoping. Dr. Jeffrey, he agreed to try, right? He tested the semen samples from both Linda and Dawn, and then a blood sample from Richard Buckland. And the results were historic here. First, the DNA from both crime scenes was a perfect match. The police were right. One man had killed both girls. But then came the bombshell that I don't think they were expecting, or that maybe they necessarily wanted to hear. The DNA did not match Richard Buckland. Richard Buckland was innocent. For the first time in history, monumental, DNA evidence had exonerated a suspect. Dr. Jeffrey would later state that he had, quote, no doubt whatsoever that Buckland would have been found guilty if not for his discovery. This meant, however, that the police were back to square one and that the community was back to square one. And they had some relief knowing that Buckland was in custody. And now that he had been exonerated, what does that mean? That means that the person who was preying upon our daughters is still out there. So what they did next was monumental. They launched the world's first mass DNA screening. They called it the blooding. They asked over 5,000 local men to voluntarily provide blood or saliva samples. They were confident, 5,000 in this community these are small villages. And so they were confident that they would find a match, but they didn't. It seemed that the killer had slipped through the net. And so now a man named Colin Pitchfork enters the chat. To the outside world, Colin was an ordinary family man. He was a very skilled baker in the community. He was married. He had 2 young sons. But behind this facade was a man with a very dark and escalating history of sexual deviancy, including multiple convictions for indecent exposure. In fact, he had later admitted to exposing himself to over 1,000 women. So, when the DNA dragnet began, Pitchfork panicked. He knew that his DNA would be a match. So, what did he do? He devised a plan. He bullied a young colleague at the bakery whose name was Ian Kelly into taking the test for him. He gave him 200 pounds and a fake passport that he had doctored with his name and Kelly's photo. And so Kelly showed up, gave his own sample with Colin's name, and was cleared. And so Pitchfork thought he was safe. His undoing actually came from his own arrogance. On August 1st, 1987, Ian Kelly was in a pub with some coworkers and, with almost an element of pride, as they described it, began boasting about how he had duped the police by giving a sample for his friend, Colin Pitchfork. A woman in this group overheard the conversation. She obviously thought this was deeply suspicious. Why would Colin need his friend to give a sample for him and claim it to be his own? That's obviously alarm bells are going off for this woman. And so she went to the police. And on September 19th, 1987, Colin Pitchfork was arrested. His DNA was taken, and it was a perfect match. So, forced with this irrefutable science, he confessed to everything. He tried to rationalize the strangulations of the girls as a way to protect his identity, but investigators saw it for what it was. They called it, quote, perverted sadism, unquote. In January of 1988, Colin Pitchfork finally pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison, and he became the first murderer in history to be convicted using DNA evidence. This case was a landmark moment, not just for catching a killer, right? But for proving the technology's profound power to protect the innocent here as well. The tragic deaths of these 2 young girls, this community's terror, and then this scientist's accidental discovery had converged to give the world one of its most powerful tools used today for justice. For some criminal cases, the stories end with these life sentences. But for the families of Linda Mann and Don Ashworth, this verdict was the beginning of a new decades-long ordeal as it applies to many other cases. Pitchfork was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years, a term that was later reduced to 28 years on appeal. As that date approached, right, the question of his release began to haunt this community that he once terrorized. In September of 2021, not that long ago, the family's worst fears were realized. The parole board deemed Colin Pitchfork suitable for release, and he walked free under a set of strict license conditions. The decision was very obviously and very rightfully met with public outrage and disbelief. But freedom for Colin would only last 2 months. In November of 2021, he was recalled to prison for breaching his conditions after approaching lone women while out on walks. Predator. What has followed since has been a very bewildering and painful legal battle. In June 2023, the parole board again ruled that Colin Pitchfork could be released. This time, however, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, intervened and he blocked that release. In December of 2023, a new panel agreed and ruled that Colin Pitchfork must remain behind bars, but the cycle continues. February of just last year, 2024, Colin Pitchfork launched his own successful challenge. And this triggered yet another parole hearing. Initially, it was set to be held in public, which was a victory for transparency campaigners. However, in July of 2024, in a stunning reversal, the hearing was moved back behind closed doors due to, quote, unforeseeable developments, including fresh allegations in respect of relatively recent conduct. For these families, this has just been an unending nightmare. Dawn Ashworth's mother, Barbara, expresses the exhaustion and the anger felt by so many. And she stated, words fail me now. He seems to want to fight no matter what. I just don't know where to go next, to be honest. He's killed 2 schoolgirls. I know what I'd do. I'd throw away the key. As of late 2024, Colin Pitchfork does remain in prison. His future does hang in the balance of his private hearings and legal challenges. The story of the Enderby murders doesn't truly end with Colin Pitchfork's conviction or even with his ongoing parole battles. Its real conclusion is written in the annals of science and justice, a legacy that has touched countless lives around the globe. The case was a dramatic, world first demonstration of DNA's profound dual power. The first time it made its mark on criminal justice, it was not just to convict a man, it was to set an innocent man free. The exoneration of Richard Buckland was a stunning event that prevented a catastrophic miscarriage of justice and gave this technology an unimpeachable moral authority right from its start. The investigative potential was immediately recognized by law enforcement agencies worldwide. The UK's Home Office moved very quickly to train forensic scientists, incorporating DNA profiling into routine police work. The success of the Narborough, quote, blooding, the world's first mass DNA screening, directly inspired the creation of the national DNA databases. In 1995, the UK established the very first one, creating a very powerful tool that has since solved an untold number of crimes and has brought closure to thousands of families. For this single case, an entire field of forensic science blossomed. Techniques like familial DNA matching, which is where relatives can provide links to a perpetrator, these are direct evolutions of the principles that were first applied here in this case. Even the ethical debates that were sparked by the mass screening, right? There were questions of privacy and civil liberties. That helped shape the laws and the regulations that help govern how this powerful technology is used even today. Dr. Alec Jeffreys, the man whose eureka moment started it all, was actually knighted for his services to science and forever recognized as the father of genetic fingerprinting. Very tragic deaths of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth left an indelible scar on their families and on their communities. But in their story, intertwined with this moment of scientific genius and a very determined police investigation, it changed the world. It armed justice with one of its most powerful tools that we still have and use to this very day. It's ever evolving. It's getting better and better every single day. And it's ensuring that from the smallest trace of evidence, a single drop of blood, a single hair, that the truth can be brought to light. It's such a powerful story. While the story is incredibly powerful and the changes that have been brought about from this case are incredibly useful, there are these ever evolving tools that we're still using and learning about today. It doesn't take away from the fact that these two beautiful girls lost their lives. And, we want to continue remembering them as well and honoring them. It's also a powerful reminder of, how these tools can be used to make sure that we're not sending innocent people like Richard Buckland to prison for the rest of their lives. This entire case just encompasses so many pivotal points that it was one that I couldn't help but to talk about with you guys. So, thanks for hanging out with me in all of my stuffy glory. I had a lot of fun talking about this one with you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Yeah, don't forget, as I'm working on building this channel and this community, please don't forget to like the video. Of course, if you like my videos in general, make sure you subscribe and then leave a comment, because it just kind of helps with engagement on the video and putting these people's stories out there for the world to hear and for all of us to remember. Every single victim's story is important in its own way, and that's why we're here. So, I will see you guys again soon this week. And until I do, please stay safe. Keep asking questions and keep unraveling. Love you.